As we move into the 18th and 19th centuries, we're going to start with Rococo. Rococo was a French style of art that was popular in the first half of the 18th century. The art was highly decorative and often depicted the aristocracy at leisure in pastel hues. Rococo painting is considered to be an extension and variation of the Baroque. It was a decorative form of art and architecture created expressly to satisfy the whims of the aristocratic patronage, not exactly the best basis from which to make art. Watteau was perhaps the first Rococo painter. He painted the aristocracy, yet he was from the lower classes. Of Flemish descent, he greatly admired Rubens. Return from Cythera here shows his affinity for color. It was painted as a submission piece to the French Academy. Paintings such as this caused the French Academy to come up with a new term to label the work, fête galante, or an elegant and graceful celebration. Boucher was a follower of Watteau, who worked for Madame de Pompadour as her chief stage designer and master decorator. As was the case with other Rococo artists, Boucher lacked Watteau's taste and subtlety. His work was often characterized by alluring nudes, as seen in his Venus Consoling Love. Boucher was criticized for knowing only how to paint breasts and bottoms. A funny aspect of his work lies in the fact that he never completely hides the occupations of his models. They were showgirls. In his paintings that were done for the aristocracy. This Venus, then, does not seem to be cut from the finest cloth, in a sense. That's a delicate irony. Fragonard was a student of Boucher after briefly studying with Chardin. Now, Fragonard was probably more successful as a colorist than was Boucher. He was a good landscape painter, but was better known for his painted situation or the intrigues, like the swing seen here. Look at the story of the picture, and you can make a subtle connection to Boucher's showgirls. Look down in the lower left-hand corner. She's just not merely swinging, but somebody is involved with looking up her skirt. I kind of compare Rococo painting to ice cream. If you eat a lot of it, you're going to get sick. If you look at a lot of Rococo paintings, you may have the same result. Claudian was the characteristic French Rococo sculptor, and he was noted for his small-scale sculpture of figural groups. Claudian's work is suggestive of Fragonard and Boucher both in the active erotic play between the figures. Can you imagine being an artist in that day and age and basically having to make art of this nature all the time? Blech. Tiepolo was perhaps the only Rococo painter of some real merit, and I don't consider Chardin to be a Rococo painter for reasons that we'll discuss when we look at his work next, and therefore I'm excluding him from this comparison. Tiepolo was called not only the greatest Italian but European painter of the 18th century, and Tiepolo was the last in the line of great fresco painters started by Giotto back around the year 1300. As seen in the text, Tiepolo revived the glories of the Venetian school in terms of his rich color range, as contrasted with the somewhat limited and more artificial palette of most Rococo painting. Tiepolo also was influenced by Rubens, Rembrandt, and even Albrecht Dürer. He was a superb draftsman, colorist, and designer. One thing that, if you get a chance to see, that's particularly nice with Tiepolo's work are his small color studies done in oil that were preparations for his tremendous fresco paintings. Now, Chardin is the painter of this period that really holds up better than any of the others. This painting of a maid is what we would call a genre painting, in that it depicts a scene from everyday life, much like many of the things that we saw in the Dutch Baroque period. This painting, however, is not typical of Chardin's work in that he primarily focused on the still life. Here's one of Chardin's still lifes with an interested observer, so to speak, there. Sometimes the observers in his still life paintings are almost as exciting as what he does with the elements arranged on the table, in that he's able to capture these fleeting moments quite gracefully, almost like Frans Hals does with a human expression. Light, form, texture, color even, all reign supreme in Chardin's tremendous meditations. It was acknowledged that he was maybe more substantial than some of the Rococo painters of the day. Even specific French critics would recognize that there was a certain moral character to Chardin's still lifes that did not perhaps exist with the rest of Rococo painting. Here's another one of those observers in a slide that's a little bleached out. The color in Chardin is a little richer. If you get a chance, check out the Chardin that's in the St. Louis Art Museum. Beautiful color, fabulous texture. You feel like you can just reach out and touch these paintings and have them come to life. And here's one last still life by Chardin. Tremendous composition, the way the pipe draws you into the center of the painting and allows you to make discoveries about color, the beautiful blues that are reflected from the lining of the chest there in the white vase. Tremendous painter. Again, a painter of substantial character. So we're going to just divorce him completely from the Rococo period and consider Chardin to be one of the first great oddballs or misfits. The influence of the Rococo artists on succeeding generations was thankfully minimal. In 18th century England, the most important work being made was in the field of portraiture, following in the footsteps of the 17th century student of Rubens, Anthony van Dyck. Thomas Gainsborough, whose work is seen here, is frequently compared to Van Dyck, as their work is highly similar. Gainsborough also was very much like Watteau in his paint handling. He was overrun by commissions, but was very easygoing, saying that painting and punctuality mix like oil and vinegar. Sounds like a few students I knew. A common practice of the day for in-demand portrait artists was to employ a drapery painter. Gainsborough did not do this, as can be seen in how the entire painting works together. Gainsborough preferred painting landscapes, which he did for pleasure, to portraits that he did as a profession, and both can be seen in his portrait of Robert Andrews and his wife. He was a rival of Reynolds, yet was posthumously praised by him for all those scratches and marks that somehow dropped into place at a certain distance by some kind of magic. Gainsborough was a founding member of the Royal Academy. Sir Joshua Reynolds was the first president of the Royal Academy. He was a learned writer on art who copied Raphael in the Vatican, and he became deaf because of the cold. I hope that doesn't happen to me. I'm rather cold in my office this morning. Reynolds thought history painting was the highest form of art, and this is ironic in that his history paintings are considered to be his failures. Reynolds also believed that portraiture could rise above mere face painting by improving on the deficiencies of nature and by using poses and gestures which recalled the great art of the past, and I think that's a pretty good idea. Reynolds was a serious, sober man whose huge output required many assistants and many drapery painters. The unusual combination of idealization and unflinching realism is found in his work, and this half belies his stated debt to the general nature of the Bolognese Academy. John Singleton Copley was the greatest American painter of the 18th century. He was extremely successful, yet plagued by self-doubt, and he didn't even believe the praise of Reynolds and Benjamin West for his work. He hesitated to leave Boston, where he earned, in his words, as much as if I were Raphael. He ultimately left America in 1774, when revolutionary activity had begun to threaten his practice. And the man we see pictured here is none other than Paul Revere. Copley's work lost its sharp focus as he adopted the more fashionable and ornate style of England when he settled there after a brief period of study in Italy. His history paintings such as Watson and the Shark dominated his last period of work. Much like Rembrandt, Copley went from being highly in demand to dying in debt. Elizabeth Louise Vigée-Lebrun was another artist no doubt influenced by the Rococo painters. These are a couple of her self-portraits. Her diary said that on the day my daughter was born, I never left my studio and went on working in the intervals between labor pains. Houdon was the leading portrait sculptor of the day, and this is his portrait of George Washington. While his work is in a neoclassical vein, he kept the gesture and expression common in portraiture in his works. And this sculpture does not so much capture personality as it does an individual's look. And in this sense, then, Houdon's work is fleeting rather than permanent. Here we see the work of Canaletto, and Canaletto was a Venetian painter whose work clearly represents a break from the Rococo, much more so than was the case with the portraitists. He was known for his veduta, V-E-D-U-T-A, and these are topographical views of towns or landscapes. This is very much like Vermeer's famous view of Delft, and for that reason, it's pretty clear that Canaletto also used the camera obscura. His patrons were English collectors who bought these paintings as souvenirs. We're going to look now at works that fall into the category called the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment refers to the second half of the 18th century and is also called the Age of Reason. Philosophers believed the world could be operated rationally, and much art of this period was made either in accordance with these principles or in direct contradiction of them. The modern world was in the process of being born, with new inventions springing from available new materials and technologies. Artists like Albinus were not content merely with making art or with studying human anatomy. They sought to do both. Here we have a painting by Joseph Wright of Derby, and Wright was one of the finest 18th century English painters. And these paintings, such as Experiment on a Bird in an Air Pump, were appropriately painted works for the Age of Enlightenment. Wright was influenced by Dutch painters like Van Honthorst, who were themselves influenced by Caravaggio. Now, Wright made history paintings out of current theories and ideas, so it's sort of a grand manner of the present. He was accomplished as a portraitist, but he was more forthright than Gainsborough. Therefore, he was less popular. After all, do you want your painting to look like you, or do you want it to look good? One further distinction between Rococo and its succeeding styles lies in the patronage of the work. A new wealthy class, the bourgeoisie, emerged at this time and bought rather different art from the aristocracy. Frequently they patronized work of a moralistic nature, as seen in the work of Hogarth in England. Hogarth was an outstanding English painter and engraver. Works such as this Marriage à la Mode were done in anecdotal series to be done as a series of studies for his immensely popular engravings as a guard against piracy. And this, in fact, is one of the engravings. Hogarth was very satirical with a slight moral. These are easy to swallow. He's not just a preacher in paint. Other scenes from this series include a girl being treated for venereal disease that she got from her husband, and killing her lover fleeing out the window. Hogarth's works are closely related to the popular theater productions of the day, which often were comedies of manner. Benjamin West was an American who settled in and spent virtually his entire life in England. A founding member of the Royal Academy, he succeeded Reynolds as president. While his early works were portraits, his fame lies chiefly with his history paintings. Even though these works depict contemporary themes, he was regarded as a radical because of his use of contemporary costumes in his paintings. One irony of West's career lies in the fact that he enjoyed the position of court painter during the American Revolution. Late in his career, West moved away from his grand manner and anticipates the art of Delacroix. We're going to turn our attention now to Romanticism and Neoclassicism. Romanticism largely was based on the belief in the value of individual experience. It was a response to the cold reason of the Age of Enlightenment, and describes some art of the 18th and 19th centuries both. Romanticism is a broad and difficult term to define. It can be seen both as the antithesis of Neoclassicism, or merely encompassing it, as classical traits replace Baroque and Rococo elements in the late 18th century. Now we see the work of Jacques-Louis Dahveed, and Dahveed was the foremost neoclassical painter. He was originally a student and distant relative of Boucher. He went to Italy to study, where he developed his taste for classical antiquity, which can be seen in his Oath of the Horatii, a work that was commissioned by the aristocracy, yet was symbolic of the revolution of democratic ideals. Further evidence of Dahveed's classical nature can be seen not only in the style of his work, but also in subject matter, as was the case with the Death of Socrates. This work was called in every sense perfect by Reynolds, who compared it favorably with Michelangelo and Raphael. Dahveed's Death of Marat was one of 3 portraits of martyrs of the Revolution. Much more than portraits, these paintings are universal exclamations of tragedy. This is a powerful and challenging design, commenting perhaps on the uncertainties of death, when you have virtually half the painting a dark plain. Dahveed's late work was about pomp and pageantry. This is Napoleon in his study. And in this sense, the painter himself was a prostitute. First off, he worked for the aristocracy. Secondly, he was seen as a painter of the Revolution. Third, he was jailed as the democracy fell. And finally, he's released from jail and paints the exploits of Napoleon. Dahveed's advice to his students was to never let your brushstrokes show. In contrast to his later works, his early paintings are far more tightly composed and reflective of his classical nature. Another aspect of Romanticism was the sublime, which reacted strongly against both Neoclassicism and the Age of Reason. The artists called sublime largely depended upon their imaginations to excite viewers with powerful passions of pain, danger, awe, and terror. Even an imaginative interior scene like Piranesi's Carceri, seen in your text, becomes a terrifying and hopeless prison view in the sublime. Stylistic variation is rich within the artists whose work is considered sublime, and four noted artists from this period are Stubbs, Fuseli, Blake, and Goya. George Stubbs was an Englishman known for his naturalistic style, and we see his work here. And Stubbs was romantic for his ignoring civilization in his work, which glorified even the more horrible aspects of nature. Henry Fuseli, seen here, was born Swiss, but painted in England. Fuseli synthesized the art of Michelangelo, the Mannerists, and Classicism with a wild imagination. The Nightmare reveals his work to be both naturalistic and dreamlike at the same time. Now we come to an artist with a great name. William Blake was a spiritual, visionary poet and painter who devised a personal symbolism to express his mystical philosophies. He was viewed in his time as an eccentric, and Blake said that his brother revealed techniques to him in dreams after his brother had passed away. Goya was a Spanish master whose works show just how far mad one might go in creating new works of art. This particular piece is an etching in aquatint, and it's part of a series of prints that he made, and this one's entitled "The Sleep of Reason Produces Monsters." In the 19th century, we find many isms. 19th century art is very complex. There are many styles and substyles. The first two currents are Neoclassicism, that we've looked at with Dahveed, and Romanticism. Neoclassicism returned to classical ideals, simple, clear, direct, and noble, with rules and intellectual control. Romanticism, on the other hand, stressed individual heroism, love, death, and ecstasy. Often, art of the 19th century combined elements of these different styles. The greatest sculptor of the neoclassic tradition was Antonio Canova, and he was the most famous artist of the Western world for some time. His earlier work was less classical in nature when contrasted to the smooth surfaces and subtle pose that's seen in the portrait of Napoleon's sister as Venus, holding the apple, now symbolic of victory. Napoleon had this sculpture hidden due to his embarrassment. Now it stands as Canova's triumph. And Canova was known for his generosity to young sculptors. John Nash's Royal Pavilion is illustrative of forces acting on all art in the 19th century. The pace of colonization, exploration, and the ease of travel served to contradict the very nationalistic tendencies which spurned it by influencing the art of all of Europe. Greece, Egypt, China, and obviously India were all major cultural influences on John Nash. François Rude was a French Romantic sculptor. His work fused dramatic movement from the Baroque with solid figures in antique garb, a more classical thing. This was one of 4 commissioned groups of figures for a triumphal arch in Paris that was initially begun to glorify Napoleon. Public acclaim for his work was great, but official honors never came, and Rude's work grew in opposition to the regime. One of his late works is Napoleon Reawakening to Immortality. The glorification of Napoleon is also seen in the work of Gros, Antoine-Jean Gros, a leading student of Dahveed. His work differs in vigorous brushstrokes, further developed sense of color, and a romantic or heroic nature. This is the original scene of propaganda. Napoleon is immune to the plague and has the ability to heal. Gross's work was never really successful in the eyes of the public or the critics, and he ended up committing suicide in despair. Doesn't look here like Napoleon cared a whole lot either way. Influenced by Gros is the French Romantic painter Theodor Jellico. He studied Raphael and Michelangelo in Italy in 1816. He copied Titian and Rembrandt in the Louvre, which was now open to the public and aspiring artists as well. He was a master of large-scale figural and landscape compositions, and Jellico would be the major influence on Eugen Dellacroix. He was a passionate horseman who only exhibited 3 major paintings before dying at the age of 33 due to a riding accident. Jellico dropped the heroic individual figures of past paintings, and more recently figures like Napoleon, but when you go back to the past, you think of figures like Christ, and employs anonymous figures arranged in a dynamic pyramidal composition that was done by artists of the past. Jellico's work differs in that this is a contemporary event, there's no central figure, and it was of a politically subversive nature. These are survivors of a shipwreck who suffered this misfortune due to some government inaction, and the event was a political scandal, and this painting was not appreciated by those in power. Perhaps Jellico's greatest achievements are best seen in his simpler or lesser works. There's energetic handling of paint here. He was a pioneer of realism, and he used rich color. Jellico was friends with a Dr. Georget, who pioneered the humane treatment of the insane. This is one of his 10 portraits of the insane, all of which are quite strong. Another pupil of Dahveed, and one of the greatest draftsmen of all time, was Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres. And Ingres summed up neoclassicism. At first, critics condemned him as primitive and Gothic, as his studies of antiquity took him farther than Dahveed had gone, all the way back to Greek vase paintings. Later, Ingres was seen as the chief preserver of neoclassicism, in contrast to Jellico and his chief rival Delacroix, and Ingres was a big influence on de Kooning. This is his Grand Odalisque, and it shows how he used line primarily to describe form. The figure is essentially flat. It's the linear contours which make it turn. Some critics have argued that she has 3 vertebrae too many. The painting is both cool and erotic at the same time. Romantics criticized his work as being merely tinted drawings, yet the color in this painting is quite rich, and the simplicity of the figure contrasts beautifully with the complex drapery. This is his Grand Odalisque again, and Odalisque is the Turkish word for harem girl. Ingres was best rewarded as a portraitist. As with the exotic odalisque, Romanticism creeps unwittingly into his work. In this painting, one thing about Ingres' work that was an inspiration to the 20th century artists like de Kooning was his cool detachment personality-wise from his models. This made him an inspiration to abstract artists to come. Beautiful textures in Ingres' work, and a great variety to the brushwork, in that you have that beautiful dress, the fantastic skin, and then the hair handled in a different manner altogether. This is a magnificent neoclassic portrait with clear, precise forms, idealized beauty, and a balanced composition. And the face is quite simply modeled, and it's even elegant when compared to the magnificent pomposity of the costume. And it's strange in that the more attention given the dress, the more striking the head becomes. This is Ingres' drawing of Louis Breton, and he said that drawing is the probity, or the integrity of art. Ingres made many formal pencil portraits like this one as studies for his paintings. Ingres influenced the Impressionist Degas, telling him to draw many lines. And the drawings are almost the opposite of the paintings in handling and attention. Here's the painting of Breton, and the garment here is incredibly and richly detailed, while the head is more simply indicated, almost the opposite of the drawing. Note that this portrait of an older man is far less idealized than our other example. Nevertheless, he does look a bit better in the painting, I suppose. The arch rival of Ingres and the leader of the Romantic movement was Eugen Dellacroix. Delacroix believed artists should feel the agony of creation. Baudelaire said Delacroix was passionately in love with passion, and he chose his images from literature or topical events, and violence charged his exotic images. He was a pupil of Jellico's teacher Guérin, and he admired Gros, Rubens, and Veronese. This is Delacroix's portrait of the violinist Paganini. Delacroix was a prodigious influence in terms of how he used color, and he was greatly admired by Cézanne. At his death, they found 9,000 paintings, pastels, and drawings in his studio. Now I want to ask you, would you like to pose for Delacroix? Here's a statement he made. If you are not skillful enough to sketch a man falling out of a window during the time it takes him to get from the 5th story to the ground, then you will never be able to produce monumental work. I know I don't want to make that pose. Now that very statement explains both the animation and accuracy of his work. This horse study is very animated and very accurate. It's a simple theme. It's romantic in nature. It's unusual for Delacroix in that the human element is missing. And like the painting of Paganini, the form takes a back seat to movement and feeling. And this is absolutely the antithesis of Ingres. This is Delacroix's Death of Sardanapalus. It's a vignette in that the action revolves around the center and fades at the edges. And again, completely different in nature from Ingres. In a play on one of the titles of a Delacroix painting, some people called this work, or called his work, the massacre of painting. Physical and emotional excess rule here as the king orders all of his possessions destroyed upon hearing of his military defeat. Delacroix's liberty leading the people is an allegorical figure of the revolution. Delacroix was interested in the popular struggle for freedom and painted a French symbol for uprising based on a semi-nude female figure of Greek origin. Baroque in attitude, this work is much more focused than the Death of Sardanapalus. Delacroix's mastery of color is best seen in his Grease on the Ruins. The color scheme that you can see in either the detail that's blown up or the full image is essentially a triad, with blue providing a vivid contrast of color to what otherwise might be a dull painting. Contrast the warmth of Delacroix's color here to Ingres, and you'll see why Ingres considered Delacroix the devil incarnate, and Rubens he called the Flemish flesh merchant. Not only did Romanticism apply to figure paintings, 19th century German painters made some highly evocative works, and Caspar David Friedrich was the most important 19th century German Romantic painter. He was influenced by the mystical work of Runge, and he conveyed a strong sense of mood through both subject and coloration in his landscapes. The power of nature and man's inability to control it, and relative insignificance, are common themes in Friedrich's work. Friedrich elevated the landscape to a level of full emotional power. His genius lay in his ability to translate the most spiritual goals of Christian art, typically seen in depictions of Christ, into a new secular language easily accepted by the viewer. While the work on the left is blatant in its symbolism, some are as simple as a monk by the sea that you see on the right, reflective of new Protestant theologians teaching that the true Christian could preserve, in spiritual terms, the spirit of Christianity without its ritual and dogmas. It's little wonder that Friedrich chose the landscape, the most awe-inspiring of God's creations, as his subject. Here we take the place of the silhouetted foreground figures, a common device used by Friedrich in staring thunderstruck at these impressive chalk cliffs. Friedrich matches the grandeur of his motif with an equally accomplished method of painting. The motif, his ideology, and his style go hand in hand, and so here we have a situation where the sum of the parts is indeed greater than the whole. The most remarkable English Romantic landscape painter was Joseph Mallord William Turner. His early work was conventional in the 17th century Dutch tradition, while his mature work is full of color and luminous, highly representative of atmosphere itself, as opposed to merely being objects in space. He was a brilliant watercolorist, and in oils Turner was first to abandon brown priming for white, and he often used undiluted yellows. While his work was highly controversial and often violently attacked, he had his supporters, notably the critic John Ruskin. Turner anticipated abstraction, as his late work found after his death contained no recognizable subjects. Ruskin also destroyed many erotic drawings that were found after Turner's death to save his hero's reputation. What a favor he did us. I hope you can hear the sarcasm through the microphone. This is Turner's Slave Ship, and it differs from Jellico's Raft of the Medusa in the focus of the work. While the subjects are essentially the same, the treatment is radically different. The horror here is incidental. Turner's style liberated color from linear enclosed forms. It's almost as if he liberated color from the brushstroke itself. The color seems to emanate from the canvas, which typically is richly colored or richly textured due to many layers of paint. Turner was fascinated with dramatic nature in the raw. The burning of the House of Lords and Commons from the 16th of October was an unusual image for Turner, in that he mixed the quite literal with the much looser handling of paint typical of his late style. It's an exciting composition in that you plunge into the space where you're rewarded and surprised both. It has a dark foreground like the work of Friedrich, and that invites us to participate in the painting. There's a marvelous balance and movement throughout the simple yet vastly interesting color scheme. Color is really something when it's liberated as it is here from solely describing form. You could argue that Turner himself is on fire here. Turner was either very abstract for a realist or very realistic for an abstract painter. Take your choice. Turner painted almost 20,000 private experimental watercolors. The perfect title for a Turner, as suggested by a critic of the past, was "A Typhoon Bursting in a Simoom Over the Whirlpool of Maelstrom, Norway, with a Ship on Fire, an Eclipse, and the Effect of a Lunar Rainbow." That does indeed sound like something that would have interested Turner tremendously. This is Turner's Steamboat in a Snowstorm, and this image gives us a better idea of the richness of color application and texture in Turner's work. The composition, like the storm itself, is a whirlwind of activity. Turner not only saw but felt, and in a large sense captured nature. Constable criticized him, saying that he seemed to paint with tinted steam. I think now this is highly complimentary. On Turner's deathbed, he asked to be taken to the window so he could die gazing at the sunset. What a romantic. Thomas Cole was the founder of the Hudson River School of Romantic Landscapes based in New York. For Cole, America was a primeval paradise, a fresh start for humanity. Communion with nature was a religious experience that cleansed the soul. During the winter, after his memory of particular locales had faded, he portrayed the essential mood of a place in his painting. Thus his work combines the real and the ideal both. And Cole was influenced by Turner and Claude Lorrain. He's best known for his Voyage of Life series that we see here. And this series of images by Cole is a commentary on the cycles of man. Not only man, but the nature of the landscape changes as well. While it's realistically painted, it's easy to see that his outlook is clearly romantic. And a romantic painter is difficult to define, but easy to feel. And contrast any of these images with Corot, and you'll make clear that distinction. The images here go clockwise from top left and show you childhood and youth and manhood and then finally old age. While this age is crowded with isms, the boundaries are not clear, even though the fights over right and wrong in art were quite spirited. Romanticism, Neoclassicism, and Realism all shared some ideas and frequently employed aspects of the other styles. This was a vastly confusing time, like that of today, yet it was very arresting.